In this video, we will go over the steps of embedding with techniques using the biopsy chip. We will discuss and demonstrate the following four main steps: removing the cassettes from the warming chamber, uncovering the sponge from the biopsy chip, embedding the biopsy chip into the mold, and tampering the tissue and cooling the block. Before we begin, there are a couple of preparation items to know. It is important that the tissue, biopsy chip, and sponge remain warm and the paraffin molten to embed properly. Therefore, immediately after processing, place the cassettes in the embedding station's warming chamber. This will ensure no cooling causes any sticking to the sponge and the removal of cores from their channels. Due to the length of the biopsy chip, it may be necessary to increase the size of the molds used to embed. The molds your lab uses may accommodate the size of the biopsy chip, but if the edges are touching or nearly touching the mold, it will cause challenges during cutting. We recommend at least 2 to 4 millimeters of space between all of the edges of the chip and the mold, as you can see. This will provide more structure to the chip for better sections and will prevent deterioration during cutting. Now let's take a closer look at some of the steps we have briefly shown. There are 2 different ways we recommend removing and working with the cassettes from the chamber. Option 1 is to remove one cassette at a time and work through the steps of embedding completely before moving on to another cassette. This will help keep the remaining cassettes warm in the chamber until they are ready to embed. Option 2 is to remove multiple cassettes and place them lid down against the warming plate until ready to embed. This will keep the top sponge warm and the paraffin molten in the waiting cassettes. Keep in mind that if cassettes aren't attended to fast enough, they could also get too hot, so it's recommended to start with one and increase as the process becomes easier. Carefully remove the lid of the cassette, making sure to not accidentally lift the sponge also. Next, grab the corner of the sponge using forceps and carefully peel it back slowly away from you. As you peel, look to make sure there are no cores attached to the sponge or removed from their channels. If any cores are misplaced, you can see which channel it came from and respond accordingly. A core sticking to the top of a sponge suggests that the paraffin may be too cool. To prevent fragmenting in trying to remove the core, place the cassette back into the holding tank or face down in the warming plate for about 1 minute. If the core is still sticking, maintain orientation as you peel the sponge back with one hand and with warm forceps, gently pull the core down off the sponge into its proper channel with the other. If need be, verify grossing information to ensure proper location. You can see why it's important to remove the lid of the cassette without accidentally grabbing the sponge. In this clip, a core is partially out of its lane, possibly by the sponge being lifted. Always check to make sure there are no fragments on the sponge before moving on. If the core hasn't cooled too much, it can be placed back into its channel. If it is stiff, sticky, or otherwise not cooperating, place the cassette back into the warming chamber or face down on the warm plate. Then attempt again to load it back into the channel. A last resort option is to remove the core and embed it alone in a block by itself. Once the sponge is removed, use forceps to place the biopsy chip face down in the center of the mold, parallel to the mold's orientation. Gently press with forceps to ensure the biopsy chip is well against the bottom before making the transfer to the cooling plate. Then make the transfer carefully, being sure not to agitate the wax and biopsy chip, as this can cause cores to slip out of their lanes. There are 2 techniques we recommend to transfer the mold to the cooling plate. Both will help keep the chip in the center of the mold and prevent moving cores. One of the options of transferring the mold to the cooling plate is to have a tamper ready with the other hand to meet the mold immediately as it touches the plate. This will only allow a very short time to make any necessary final adjustments to the chip's placement before the paraffin solidifies. The next option is, while the mold is still on the warming plate, to place the tamper down into the wax, pressing down on the chip and cores while the transfer takes place. This will ensure cores stay pinned while making the transfer and that the biopsy chip remains centered. In either of these options, be sure that the tamper is flat. because pressing at an angle can cause the chip to slip from under the tamper and possibly lead to a loss of core placement. Now that we've gone through the individual steps in detail, let's see what the whole process looks like together. And that does it. We'll see you in the next video on cutting and sectioning.